I'm
Right.
really, really excited that you're able to join us. So welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So what we kind of normally do at the beginning to give the listeners a chance to understand a little bit more about our interviewee, if you like, is ask them if they could give us a little bit of their sort of past history, because that's always interesting in the sense of sort of forming context with which to kind of explain how you've turned up doing what you're currently doing. So are you able to give us a little bit of an insight into your journey to where you are today?
Yeah, I'd love to. So if I go right back, turn back the clock, and I left school at 16, so I didn't go to university like many do. I started working with cars, and it wasn't too long before I realized that wasn't my calling. And actually what I wanted to do was earn a bit more money. And so, I thought, well, where can I earn money without having a formal education? I know I'll move into sales. Kind of follow my dad's footsteps. He was a businessman at the time, did lots of international travel. I thought, oh, I want some of that. So I first started working for Kirby vacuum cleaners back in 1993, knocking doors, running the streets of Oxfordshire at the time, booking meetings throughout the day, and then doing demos in the evening. And then following that, I went on to double glazing. Eventually, I got into recruitment. But that was after trying to get into B2B sales. I really wanted to get into B2B sales because I thought, well, that's the next step up. That's really professionalizing. That's a more professional kind of sales. Knocked lots of doors, sent lots of CVs and covering letters. And of course, I didn't have any B2B sales experience. Neither did I have a degree to fall back on in order to get in through some sort of graduate program. And so 4 years in recruitment I spent. For the last 18 months of that 4 years, I was working with this wonderful US-based email marketing software business, and I'd helped them hire 4 or 5 key people for their organization for their European expansion. And they said to me, look, you've done a great job. Would you consider joining us as an account manager? And I thought, great. Yeah, I'd love to. So joined them as an account manager. And within 4 months, I'd become UK business development manager. I thought, yes, I finally made it into B2B sales after about 7 years of trying. It was the year 2000 now. And boy, did I have a rude awakening, let's say. B2B sales wasn't as easy as I thought it might be. I think in a 6 or 7 year period, I must have had 7 different managers, lost my job once. I was on the verge of losing my job for the second time for poor performance when there was a switch that went in my head. I realized that, I cared a great deal about the customer, perhaps too much, and not enough about the commercial outcome that I was driving for them. And when that switch went, all of the training, all of the, previous years of practicing and doing what I was doing to try to be successful came together. And then I enjoyed several years of high performance, 200 to 300% of my number. Fast forward 18 or so years, and I've now enjoyed 24 years in B2B sales. Lived in 3 different continents, run sales teams across 4 different continents. Built a business from $0 to $22 million within a 4-year period, and really transformed the way that we sold from product-led to value-based selling. And today I run a small B2B sales consultancy called Supero, and I've spent the last few years really trying to uncover why organizations struggle to generate conversations with their target audience at scale.
Okay, that's a fantastic history, Alex. We'll come back to some of the comments that you've been making about your sort of uncovering process a bit later on, but I want to take you right back to the beginning, just very briefly, partly because those Kirby vacuum cleaners that you were selling were a fantastic product, weren't they?
They were. They were.
and
An expensive one
they
as
were,
well.
yeah, it was very expensive. And I remember my in-laws may have been some people you could have sold to, Alex. They were living on the Warwickshire. I know you were Oxfordshire, so maybe you didn't go up quite that far north, but they did buy one, and it's still being used to this day. This is going back many years, down at our place we've got in France. So it's still going.
Yeah,
It's still performing.
They were hard wearing
but
things.
yeah, they were really, they're very heavy, not that easy to carry around, different floors. But yeah, you've really had quite an interesting kind of B2C experience, and I'm sure that you would have learnt a huge amount, about sales from those early days of sort of knocking on doors. I guess quite a lot of cold calling, building up your territory, your patch. I'm surprised at how many people have actually come into B2B sales from that sort of B2C environment. And I think it does give you sort of, what does it teach you? Because I also did B2C as well in my early stage career. I think it teaches, well, it taught me a lot about resilience. Apart from anything else. It also taught me about the importance of selling something that you really believe in. And I'm not sure that I really believed in what I was selling at the time, but I was enjoying the whole experience of getting involved in sales in those days. It beat working in a rather stuffy bank, which is where I was when I first left school or college. But so that's really interesting. Your background.
Back in those days, Phil, it was I was so driven by this desire to want to make money, and did for many years, but ultimately realized that that wasn't the most important thing if you wanted to earn money, ironically. But we would it was often incredibly difficult to motivate yourself to get out in the cold and knock doors for 8 hours. And so we used to sing songs in the morning, which initially I thought was stupid and silly, but actually realized that it really got the blood flowing and got you sort of inspired. Without making a fool of myself in this conversation with you. There was one that I'll never forget called Rhino, and it would be RHI, RHI, RHINO, Rhino. And we would kind of chant that because we needed to have skin as thick as a rhinoceros in order to do the job that we were doing.
So I assume you're not doing that today. That's not your sort of early morning mantra. I think it's ice bath bathing, from what I've discovered from a since conversation. But
that's it.
Still, you need to be fairly resilient to do that.
Ice bath and breathing today.
And breathing, fantastic. Rhino. God, I don't think we had any songs that we used to sing when I worked in the insurance sector. But really interesting. Can I just go back to you talked about your father briefly, about him running a business.
Yeah.
Was there a reason why you didn't follow into your father's footsteps, so to speak? Sort of
Yeah.
follow him into his business?
Yeah. I aspired to, but he was in business for himself, and I think when that crossroads appeared, there was no opportunity for me to move into his business.
Okay.
Or perhaps he didn't feel I had reached a standard, a good enough level yet. But
Yeah.
a few years later, he tried. So it was,
Yeah.
maybe 4 or 5 years later where I really wanted the opportunity to work with him. And by
Right.
which time I'd become this expert in email marketing, and email marketing in those days was still quite new. And so, being an expert within email marketing, I guess like any relatively new field, you command a bigger salary than someone that was perhaps
Right.
selling, something else in B2B sales.
Yeah.
And I couldn't afford to take the drop. He could
Yeah.
afford to pay me a certain salary, and it was 50% of what I was on. And at the time, I
Right.
had outgoings and a mortgage, and I just couldn't
Yeah.
make it work, which is a shame. But then, I look at today, and I've got three sons, Jordan,
Yeah.
Jensen, and Jude, 27,
Right.
23, and 16. Both Jordan and Jensen, the older boys, have worked with me and moved on to
Right.
bigger and better things. And now Jude works with me as an apprentice content creator, following
Wow.
kind of media and content creation, something he loves.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fun.
So you've
It's
got
funny
three
how
boys.
yeah, as children, we kind of miss out on things perhaps that we felt that we should have been able to do, and then as we become parents ourselves, we try and fill those gaps, as it were, or prevent the worst from happening, as the case may be.
Yeah. That's also really interesting.
Yeah,
Um, you obviously favor the Jays, don't you? With the naming of your sons.
definitely.
So I think that's also amusing. It's quite interesting because my upbringing was that my father worked for a telco company. He was an engineer, a telecoms engineer, but the company he worked for, Cable and Wireless, used to would send people out to run telephone operations in different countries. And so for the first 18 years of my life, I was traveling with my parents as they moved from Ascension Island in the middle of the Atlantic to Malta, to Aden, to Sierra Leone, Trinidad, Middle East. So I spent the formative years of my life up to the age of 18
Yeah,
um, living in different countries, coming back to the UK for education. But interestingly, as a parent, uh, um, you of course I appreciated this incredibly rich background experience in living in different cultures. Amazing.
yeah,
But it was a very transient lifestyle. So we felt for our children that we would stay put in the UK and, in fact, in the same house for 35 years. So we went the opposite. When I was a child, we did the opposite to what my parents have done. But of course,
yeah,
my children are now chastising us for not traveling and giving them so you never quite can get to, you can never quite get to
yeah,
satisfy everyone all the time. But I like you, do have a son in the business. Will is in the business, and
yeah,
it's fantastic having him in the
yeah.
company as well. So,
And a lovely lad
so
he is.
that's
I met him
oh,
at
you
the
yeah, of course you've met
event.
him.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
thanks, Alex. So let's move on to the B2B area. And I think it would be great to hear because you've had some amazing roles in the B2B space. Would you mind just giving a quick breakdown of the kind of roles that you had? You talked about working on different continents. I mean, It's been an
Yeah.
incredibly rich experience you've had in that world.
Yeah.
Amazing, considering that you didn't start off in the B2B area. You've really ended up by landing some amazingly, strategic roles, I understand.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they weren't always strategic, but I remember I was working for a business called Experian Cheetah Mail. It was my second stint at Experian, and that was my inflection point there when I was at Cheetah Mail, where I realised what was missing from my approach. And so,
Yeah.
after spending a few years of winning some strategic pieces of business for us, like Vodafone and John Lewis. You probably
Mm.
remember the Arcadia Group. That
Yes,
group
yes,
of
absolutely.
six or
That
seven
Philip
retail.
Green, was it?
Yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah.
right, that's right. That sort of made a name for myself in the industry, and this tech company called Responsys, who were considered kind of the Rolls Royce in their field, headhunted me. They tried a couple of times, and that was a real step up for me. I went from transactional, you know, pilot high, sell it cheap. It was volume of sales, blending enterprise deals with mid market and even SMB deals into pure enterprise, and that really was a step
Right.
up. But I really believed in myself, and I had a system that worked. And what was you know I
Yeah.
was incredibly grateful that Responses invested in us. They gave us formal challenger sales training, and
Yeah.
that helped me step up my game and really understand how to position differentiated commercial value. And
Yeah.
so, that in that first year, uh, achieved President's Club status. So,
Right. Yeah.
apparently I was the only, or the first person, I should say, to win President's Club, joining partway through a year. So I didn't have the
Okay.
luxury of kind of building a territory and a network, and then
Yeah.
uh, uh, you know, uh, and then doing a full year. I kind of joined partway through the year, so to achieve that was a really great thing, and they awarded me with a trip to, I think we went to Mexico, and
Great.
it was in a pool in Mexico, chatting to a friend of mine who actually I was recruiting for back in 1999. That was the email marketing company
Oh,
um,
yeah.
that I was recruiting for. He gave me my lucky break into B2B sales. He was now a sales director at this company that I'd joined, but in the US. And we were talking about him. He was telling me, "Hey, I'm moving to Australia, and it'd be great if you join me." And so, long story short, I did. I managed to convince my wife to relocate to
Yeah.
Australia. That was probably the hardest deal I've ever had to do in my career. Um,
Of course.
and we did. That was in the May. We did a recce trip in the August that year, and then by January we were living in Australia, and my job was to kickstart sales.
Right.
And in 7 months from a standing start, had closed three strategic pieces of businesses. They were cross-channel deals, so we had multiple products that we were selling as part of the
Mm.
solution. So that was one example. Another was we came back later that year, by the way, and I was promoted into a leadership role at the same company.
Right.
So I came
Yeah.
back with Responses to the UK. My old manager, who I'd left on great terms with, by the way, we had an agreement. We basically said, so before going to Australia, I'd said, look, if you let me go, I'll do two things. I'll hit my number before I go, and I'll hire my replacement, which I did. So coming back, it was quite an easy door to
Okay.
open.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was quite happy to create a new role for me, which was to to run the enterprise sales team. So so I did that, and then not long after, Oracle had acquired us. It was maybe 18 months after, and so
Yeah.
that was a bit of a shock for us all, actually, because we were all building this $1 billion SaaS organization. Everybody was aligned to the North Star, and so it felt a bit like we'd been punched in the gut or the wind out of our sails, So and by that time I'd been promoted to run Northern Europe, and anyway, Oracle acquired us. Big change in our strategy, and I was asked to run the UK enterprise team. I said, "Come on, I feel like I'm going in the right direction from UK to Europe. I want something more." And because we were being absorbed into a much bigger organisation, with more clearly defined territories across Europe, really the only region left was a region called ECEMEA, so Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So I said, "Look, give me a chance to do something with that territory." So I was running UK enterprise plus that territory. I took one of my key performing reps and said, "How do you fancy having a go at this territory?" 103 countries in that territory. 30,000 accounts Oracle had in that territory. So I said, "Look, the way we're going to be successful is to define our value proposition, be really clear about, from the 6 or 7 products we were selling, what's the value prop we're taking to market and which vertical are we going after." So we decided that the average order value was 200K. We knew that if we did X number of those deals, then we'd hit our target. And we were only going to focus on 5 countries out of the 103 retail. And so we did $2.2 million in the first year. I then went from 1 person to 6 people, so hired 5 more people. I relocated to Dubai. My wife had started to get used to the moving by this point.
Okay.
So that wasn't too difficult, that one. Had to make sure we were in a nice house, but
Sure.
but fast forward 4 years, and collectively the team under my leadership had built a $22 million recurring revenue business. We had, from scratch, from 1 person selling in the UK, we were 40 people by the end of that 4 years, 22 in sales and the rest in customer success and pre-sales, marketing and partnerships. We had, because of our success, the consulting team hired in the region. So we had 5 people in our consulting team supporting us. So that was an amazing experience. That was one of the best times in my career, and thanks to me having such a great team around me, we were able to do some fantastic things. And then 2018 Christmas Eve, I came back to the UK.
Okay.
And then a few months
Still
later,
with the same organisation, or had you decided to move on from Oracle?
Same organisation. So I stayed with Oracle. I took on a role in order to sort of relocate back to the UK. I took on a leadership role for one of our ad tech products, and then a few months later was promoted into a European leadership position. So running the marketing cloud business for our enterprise segment. So we were about 45 people, 6 sales leaders reporting into me, about 37 reps covering Western Europe. And the mandate there was to grow, but essentially it was to transform the way that team was selling from product led to a more value-based approach,
Yeah.
because the average order value had dropped so low. And so by the
Yeah.
end of my time in that role, we'd quadrupled the average order value. And
Yeah.
that was 2020 when I left Oracle, when
Right.
COVID had hit.
Yeah. 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 Really interesting. And was it since then you've set up your own practice, Alex? Is that
Yeah.
it sort of once you left Oracle, you decided that you would move into this area? Listening to your kind of journey and your story, and I'm possibly simplifying this a little bit, but it seems to me in the early stages of your career, at least, the kind of products and solutions you were selling was very much focused on this whole sort of prospecting and business development sort of data. Am I right in saying that
On
kind
the
of
data,
angle? Yeah,
yeah, on the data side, yes, but for the majority of my career, it was selling marketing technology solutions and services. And it
right.
wasn't until the
Okay.
time at Oracle where we sold, so we would consider that B2C. So selling
Yeah,
to
yeah,
other businesses, but it was essentially a B2C solution for them. Wasn't
got
until
it.
my time at Oracle when we, they had a much bigger portfolio of products. So we were selling
Yeah,
B2C and B2B. And so lead
yeah,
generation was uh, a big focus. We were selling sales tech, let's say. So Martech and
yeah,
sales tech, big focus on
yeah.
data.
Okay, but even within the B2B space, it's still that that kind of lead generation angle, because I think that's become,
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken, that's become an area of focus for you in
Yeah.
your current practice. I may be again simplifying things too much, but I get a sense that you are quite passionate about this whole area of how best to cultivate relationships, how best to build new relationships, and but I may be simplifying what I'm asking you or suggesting a bit too much. I mean, obviously
No,
you've got, yeah. Sorry, Alex. Yeah,
well, you're right. I think, with by this point, with what 30 years experience in sales, the one thing that really influences performance the most is the relationships that we have with people,
mm,
and uh, the quality of conversations that we have with them. And so,
mm,
I always, I was naturally a relationship builder throughout my
mm,
career, and Challenger really taught me something new that I could add to my armory, if you
yeah,
like. But if I look at why Supero exists, Supero exists because, um, I'll tell you a little story actually, Phil. So,
mm,
when we set Supero up, we weren't totally sure in the direction that we wanted to go. At least I knew I wanted to get from A to B. I just wasn't sure how I was going to get there. And so I had this
mm,
idea that I would productize services from the knowledge in my head, which I
yeah,
underestimated how difficult that would be for me to do personally. I imagine it's not that difficult for many others, but we sort of hit a moment in COVID where that's where I wanted to go. But when I was talking to prospective customers, they were telling me, well, we don't need those services. We just need leads. So we were
mm,
sort of pulled into, and when I say we, it was me and my two eldest sons who were on furlough. We were kind of pulled towards, what I called, say, providing sales as a service, which is a fancy
yeah,
word for lead generation services, basically.
yeah,
So I had this idea I would provide go-to-market strategy to these MarTech, sales tech, ad tech
yeah,
organizations I was very familiar working with. Um, uh, and my boys would then be kind of the execution, the outbound lead generation. And in that first year, we won 7 retained clients. I thought, well, okay, this is easy. I thought it'd be hard building a business. And then reality struck. And that reality was that we were in this, we were right in the eye, kind of the eye of the storm. This inflection point was happening in the industry, where, buyer behavior had been changing for a decade and a half already, since, certainly since the Challenger sale, Brent Adamson and Matt Dixon had brought it to my attention back in 2010, that buyers would rather do their research behind closed doors and not speak to salespeople. And so what we saw in that decade and a half was sales and marketing organizations just continue to try and get more from less, do more calls, send more emails. So when we set Supero up and we were following those old techniques, we really struggled to make our clients successful. And so, my eldest son at the time, he's still my son, but my eldest son at the time working with Supero, was really struggling with the rejection. He was more of an academic, although he's a creative at heart, but when he reads a book or understands how to do something and then applies it, that kind of doesn't understand why it doesn't work. And so he really struggled. His I would say his mental health was really suffering in that first year. So I was thinking, right, something's got to change. And I met so an old friend of mine, actually, a guy called Adam Gray, and his partner, who wrote the book on social selling. I met his partner. I kind of rekindled that friendship with Adam and had an aha moment. So Adam was talking to me about social selling, and I thought, well, this is what we need to be doing. This is what we need to help other companies see. Social selling had quite a few negative connotations at the time, but we started practicing it. I put the boys through a training program, and we spent the following 6 to 12 months becoming experts at social selling, and it was just a complete transformation. Jordan went from setting up 1 to 2 meetings a week to 10 to 15 meetings a week at times. His call rate improved 6.7 times. And it was like night and day, the difference between seeing him suffering to then seeing him enjoying his job, activating his creativity, working on developing his personal brand, doing these cool videos to increase his visibility within his target audience. And that was, seeing him go through that transformation was just fantastic, not just as his manager, but as his dad as well. And then that was the starting point to the transformation I made with Supero towards the conversation operating system, which, I can talk some more about today if you like.
Yeah, no, I was going to say it's often that sort of early generation of interest is one of the most challenging aspects of the sales cycle. And I was going to ask you sort of what, from your experience now, what are some of the key mistakes companies are making who want to kind of improve the efficiency through which they start this nurturing of relationships and leads from the beginning? I mean, clearly you've gone through a big learning curve yourself. You're now seeing a great success, but I'm sure you often come against companies who have a sort of fixed idea about what they think they need and asking you to implement it. But what are some of the big mistakes you think companies make?
Well, if we're talking about companies as opposed to people, I think we've been testing now for 3 years. 2 years of which, certainly 18 months, we've been tracking everything that we've been doing, For 2 years, we've been
Yeah.
testing social selling techniques. But if you look at the last 3 years, when you combine that transition point from cold calling, cold emailing, webinars, and all of the other stuff we were doing to drive leads through to today, it's a 3-year period of testing. And what I found
Yeah.
was in that second year was, this light bulb moment, this eureka moment when we realized how effective social selling was. I couldn't understand why companies weren't doing this at scale. Why weren't more
Yeah.
companies doing social selling? And what I realized was there were two things. We boiled it down to two things. So one is
Right.
they're measuring the wrong things. So companies will
Okay.
buy some social selling training. They'll perhaps put their team or a few of their team through a pilot. They may have even tried to, scale it within their organization. But because operationally they're measuring the old way of doing things, they're never really measuring the things that drive the right behaviors at the individual sales rep level that will then drive a sustainable level of
Yeah.
performance. And so those things like network growth and the number of posts, but with a focus on how human the posts are.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
the the number of social networking conversations, relevant social networking conversations that salesperson is inserting themselves into. The number
Yeah.
of calls off the back of that, and then the percentage of those calls that progress with a meaningful next step. Okay, those last two are quite lag measures, but unless you're
Yes. Yeah.
measuring the things that really matter when it comes to effective social selling, it's impossible to drive the change that you
Yeah.
need, the transformation that you need within the business. And then the second thing, which is
Right.
not a nice segue onto the second thing actually, is personal change. And we know change is hard for any organization. We know change is particularly hard for individuals when they're being asked to do things they're incredibly uncomfortable about. And social selling is uncomfortable for some people. And so, meeting Dr. Grant,
Yes.
again, having another, light bulb moment, epiphany moment. It's like, this is the missing pillar from what I'm doing. And
Mm.
so, having a method that then empowers the individual to critically reflect on what's being asked of them so they can make an informed decision. And it might be unfavorable, but at least they make a decision.
Yeah.
Then the individuals going through the program, learning the skills, are more likely to change. And when the
Yeah.
individual embraces the change on their terms, that's when
Yeah.
transformations happen. And that's really,
Yeah. How
you know,
interesting.
those two pillars were the missing link for me that came sort of the
Yeah.
beginning of last year, where I realized, this is it. This is now the conversation operating system. This framework is what is going to empower organizations to
Yeah.
drive the transformation they need in order to create
Yeah.
conversations with their target audience, which after all, that's what everybody wants to do in business today. They want to grow.
Yeah. The it's interesting. You're focusing on sort of to be human and and also the personal change element. But on
Yeah.
the human side, it really takes time, doesn't it, to work out uh, how you might want to nurture a relationship with someone that you perhaps don't know, and bring in that human element. So I imagine that whereas the conversion ratios um, are much better doing it this way, there may be a sort of period of time where you're not actually seeing success because it takes time to build those personal relationships. Or do you think it is possible to connect at a human to human level more quickly, more effectively, using certain types of approach?
Yeah, I think at the individual level, success can come quickly. So
Okay.
there's two sides to this coin, though, Phil. So if we
Yeah.
take one example, so a guy called an old friend of mine, actually from Experian, um, had joined an ad tech company in the US. He'd been there 5 months, working tirelessly with his SDR to generate meetings with a very small focus account list of companies.
Yeah.
He'd managed to create one new meeting with his territory, and there were 5 existing customers in his territory. You might think, well, they're existing customers, surely they'd want to meet him.
Yeah.
As we know, that's not always the case.
Yeah. Yeah.
He'd seen what I'd been doing on LinkedIn. He gave me a call. He said, I need some help. And he was ready to change. He was he'd not long moved to Lake Tahoe with his girlfriend and his dog Atos, and the last thing he needed to be worrying about was trying to find a new job when they were renting and saving for a house. You need a salary to get a mortgage.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so within the first 4 weeks, he'd secured 2 new meetings, and his account
Wow.
list was relatively small, about 60 accounts. Two new meetings, and then by the end of 5 months, so an exact mirror time period, before and after, he'd completed 36 meetings. He'd in 16 of the accounts. He had so he penetrated his territory 15 times, 15 times increase. He was engaged with 6.4 times more stakeholders in those engaged accounts, and he had one of the largest pipelines in North America, and
Yeah.
he's up there, I think, in the top 30% this year,
Yeah.
transitioning into
Wow.
their new financial year. He's got a
Yeah.
5 times multiple in pipeline, and I believe a large percentage of his open pipeline is committed to close in the first half. So he's in a very good place
Yeah.
now. That's an individual. I think from
Yeah.
a organization perspective, this is where it gets tricky, because you've got so many opinions at the leadership level about what works
Yeah.
and doesn't work. Combine that with the fact that the operation and the sales tech stack is primarily geared towards measuring calls and emails and lots of lag measures that do not drive the behaviors that make a difference when it comes to
Yeah.
generating conversations in a more relationship first manner. And that's one
Yeah.
of the biggest problems I see today.
Though there is obviously technology emerging, whether it's Gong or others, that sort of pick out some of the emotional kind of messaging that may be in conversations or emails. But it's quite interesting. I'm looking at the work at the moment of Professor Liz Stokoe, who was at Loughborough University and a real expert on conversation analytics. I'm not sure if you've come across her name before.
No, what's
And
her
she's
name?
since Elizabeth Stokoe, Stokoe. And I do hope that she's going to come and talk at this coming GST event. And we invited one of her colleagues to come and talk about 5 years ago. And they study conversation down to the minutest of detail, its pause, its emphasis, its words. And they typically get involved in analyzing crisis negotiation conversations with people wanting to, threatening to commit suicide, or hostage negotiation conversations where the conversation is very, very carefully recorded. Of course, in the call center environment, you have the chance to have recorded conversation where you can start to look at the nuance of language and pausing. But I've always been kind of interested in how a word can completely change the outcome of a
Yeah.
conversation. But when you look at the word on its own, it looks like pretty innocuous. You can't really teach people to sell more based on that one word. But what goes into that one word is really where the magic has happened. The emotional intelligence of knowing when to write one word or say one word, because it can then trigger what Liz Stokoe calls a turn in the conversation, a reaction or action that could be positive or negative.
Yeah.
And I've been really interested in the sort of I'm currently, for some reason, I've come back to this topic again,
Yeah.
partly because some of the big enterprise opportunities that we've seen close have been closed on words like "let's go on the fun bus together," or
Yeah.
they're not. It's not an alternative close, or it's an assumptive close, maybe. But the way you choose the word, who would say "fun bus"? Why would you use those words? It's just. But it takes an awful lot of intuition, and this comes back to your point about the human
Yeah.
side, which is where I think those that are good at connecting at a human level, they pick up these signs and signals, and somehow they're able to pull that into their lead development program, perhaps. Am I talking nonsense, Alex, or is it kind of
No,
interesting for you?
I get it. It's super interesting for me. It's I, you know, the hours and hours I used to pour over writing an email, choosing the right
Yeah,
wording based on what I knew about that individual, uh,
yeah,
would often be it would be the difference between getting a response and not getting a
yeah,
response. I
yes,
do think, though, there's, when I look at the problem that organizations have today, in
yeah,
terms of, if they could fix just
yeah,
one thing that would exponentially improve their growth,
right.
uh, it's getting the conversation in the first place. And
I
so
agree. Yeah,
where
yeah, I
where
agree.
I where I'm spending most of my time doing the work that I'm doing, I'm really trying to crack the code
Yeah,
in terms of what you need to do in order to get the conversation in the first place. Then when you've got the conversation, how do you make that conversation as impactful
yeah,
as possible? So I'm a
yeah,
huge fan on storytelling, and I don't know if we've got time for it today, but when I kind of talk about those two things, I then think,
yeah,
well, in order for that to work effectively, the strategy has to change. And so, whilst
mm,
companies continue to look at sales and marketing as a funnel, a traditional funnel,
yeah,
they're never going to allow themselves the time or the freedom of thinking to
yeah,
flip that on its head. And actually, rather than look at everything as if it's, you know, the 5% of a territory that might be in market for what you're selling
yeah,
today, actually look at the 100% of the territory that is full of people, interesting
mm,
people, that if you approach them in the right way, they'd be willing to have a conversation with you.
yeah,
And so building relationships with 100% of your territory will then by default mean that more people will
mm,
come to you when they're ready to buy, especially if
yeah,
you've been following social selling, because it's consistently clear about who you are, what you do,
yeah,
um, and that you're genuine and authentic, worth having a
yeah,
chat with.
yeah. Well, I am a bit conscious of time, Alex. The time has really raced on, and I don't think we'll have time to go into the storytelling.
Okay.
But maybe
Next.
we could, on a future podcast, cover that topic
Yeah.
with you. But I really think that you are honing in on what is one of the most difficult things of selling, is getting that sort of initial conversation going. And if I go back to those early days of cold calling, and I know that that's where we started off our conversation, that was often the bit that needed to happen in order for a sale to happen. So in a way, I can see that with the journey that you've had, it's kind of, and me also, I would say to some point, it's getting that initial conversation going, which is the key, so much of a key, and yet it's the hardest part of sales. So I think you really are honing in on such an important area, and kudos for you for sort of making it a real science. I
Yeah.
can see that you've backed up all of your kind of findings with data and research that comes across in the way you're talking about it,
Yeah.
kind of as well, which is also important. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
sense there's a paradigm shift required with a lot of kind of director level people, perhaps, of recognizing that there may be another way of going about this, the sort of conversation initiation that needs to happen either with key accounts or with new prospects. And I'm
Yeah.
sure that that journey is going to continue, and I'm sure you'll benefit hugely from it. Yeah.
Yeah. Indeed.
Alex, thank you so much for your time. I think probably we would need to draw things to a conclusion. But Alex, if there are three things that you would like people to pick up on as a consequence of listening into the podcast, what for you would be the top three things? You may have mentioned this already, but what would be the top three things?
Um, yeah, I think for the sales leaders out there, I think you've touched on it just there, Phil. It's recognizing that there is a better way, um, but in
Right.
order to be successful doing it, uh, they're gonna, they'll need support from sales ops or rev ops to make the change
Yeah.
required to achieve that outcome, that desired
Yeah.
outcome. I think for individuals that are keen or interested in this topic, it really starts with it really starts with your personal brand, but within that, spending the time to decide what you want to be known for. What are the things that
Okay.
intrinsically motivate you, and anchor down on those things that will form
Yeah.
a key part of your approach and your content creation.
Mm.
And I think if there's a third thing, it would be um, trust the process. Have a process and trust the process. And
Mm.
as I've proved over the last 2 years, if you follow a process and you're systematic with it,
Yeah.
you can achieve some of the successes that I've talked about on this podcast today, Phil. And if
Yeah.
I give you one more data point, we found when comparing social selling and the conversation operating system with cold calling and cold emailing. And by the
Yeah.
way, before I give these data points, when I say this, I mean a social selling first approach. You still have to call people and email people. I'm not saying it's one or the
Yeah.
other, but we found when taking a relationship first approach on an open territory, we see
Yeah.
across a range of different experiences that the call rate increases to 10.5%, and the call progression rate is as high as
Mm.
39%, because it's clear
Wow.
to those people who you
Fantastic.
are and what you do before you
Yeah.
request the call.
Linked so much into some of the work we've done around values for selling, around sort of authenticity. And we often address this issue of manage myself as a core pillar on the master's journeys that we have, which,
Yeah.
by the way, you or your sons need to come on at some point, Alex. I
Yeah,
know we talked
indeed.
about you on the, TST.
Yeah,
But it's so important. It's and it links very much with knowing what your personal brand is and what you want it to be. So just want to say a huge thank you for everything you've shared. There will be, for those of you listening, of course, in the show notes, if there's anything that any of you want to follow up on, you'll be able to follow up on this directly with Alex. You'll see it in the show notes below the podcast, how you can contact him as well. But Alex, I just want to say a huge thank you for the time we've had together. It's been a
yeah.
brilliant chance to get to know you, and even better, even more. So thank
Thanks
you.
for having me. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.